Well, hello, everybody. This is Dr. Amanda Helman, and I am live on the Traumaplicity talk show that happens at 7 o'clock p.m. every Wednesday on the Amanda Helman author and speaker show. So it's nice to see all of you. And we are looking at trauma, which is trauma plus simplicity, meaning our brain actually will heal better with from trauma when we think about it using simple steps on a journey. And so certainly I'm really excited to be on here. I'm really looking forward. I want to share with you that as we move forward, I am excited. I have so many incredible guests coming up in the next upcoming half of the year, or the rest of the year, essentially. And so you can be looking forward to some new shows. And by the end of probably in the next few months, at least by August, Traumaplicity Talk Show will be on YouTube. Instead of an apple a day with the Dr. Amanda, we're going to be on to the podcasts again. And I have so many other episodes, so you get to listen to it. And it will be on the Amanda Helman author and speaker show. So I'm really excited about this. And so upcoming guests that will be on are Suzanne Burns, and she is going to be on next week. And so then after that week, we have Elizabeth Kipp, Dan Stillman, Manna Abraham, and Brooke Kikos. And all these different people will be talking in areas of accidents, loss, sexual trauma, physical trauma, medical trauma. And so each week I'll be telling you what they're going to be talking on and giving you some other information about their bio and who they are. So I'm really looking forward to it because each person has unique background. And so I wanted to just share with you the new upcoming things that are going to be happening as we move forward. So this is very, very exciting. And so if you're on, you can certainly say hello. I would love to see all of you. And so, yay, I see myself. But if you are here, if you are on here, you can join me live for tonight, or you can watch it later. It's all good. It's all good. So I'm going to be talking tonight about the impact of trauma on the brain. And interestingly enough, research is coming together, and that's what I love. We don't have siloed information, but we have information together. And the best thing is that for information today, we're finding that just like the cortisol which is a hormone, which is part of the neurotransmitters that impacts our body from the mother to the child, this happens in the womb. Trauma happens before the womb. It can happen essentially when you have families, and if we haven't learned we didn't know how to heal the trauma. And so what happens is it impacts not just us, but it impacts individuals in our children and our children's children. And it also impacts us, the new traumas that we also happen to us. And so when traumas happen, so think about, we have our brain and we have different impacts to our limbic system, our frontal cortex, and our brainstem. And what happens is all of I call it the triune brain. There's other people who have 4 parts, but I love triune because I believe the limbic system and midbrain, just from the research and understanding the brain better, really work together. Essentially, they're in the same place. And so the limbic system is a big, huge part of healing. And what's really great is different doctors now are finding, neurobiologists, medical doctors, people are looking at even genetics and the neurobiology of families. And what I find interesting across counseling and education is that we're realizing that we're getting a lot more answers. And that's with looking at, Dr. Dan Siegel looks at the brain and he looks at different parts of the brain, right, and how they work, and thinking about the medical part. But we also have Bessel van der Kolk, who talks about how we can either shut down, and he talks about the brain where some people shut down all their emotions, it almost freezes, and then post-traumatic stress symptoms can come up later, or we go into hypervigilance, or we even go into hyperarousal, which is where we're anxious and we actually remember what happened and it impacts us that way. And both ways are still impactful because our brain is either activated and remembering it and dealing with it, or it shuts down. And that's exactly what happens. Our brain does that depending on us and even how we're impacted. We either deal with it now or later in what's called post-traumatic stress, which could be diagnosed later down the line. And so when we're talking about the brain, when trauma happens early, our brain gets impacted. Our brain does recognize that we've had trauma, but it happens in different ways. People used to call it resiliency, where kids are able to handle some of that growth as good. But in fact, what happens is when you're younger, the traumas end up going subconscious or unconscious. I call it subconscious and unconscious because there's two different parts of that happen. But basically, it's unconscious, undealt with memory, cellular memory trauma that happens in our brain. It impacts our belief systems, our beliefs about ourselves, our belief about what other people are thinking about us, and even how we think. And we've found that there's neurobiologists, fMRI studies that show that the brain before and after trauma you can actually see the different impact on the brain, especially in the executive functions, especially with different parts of the brain and how the children are thinking. In fact, even when you're looking at limbic system, different parts, hippocampus, you have the amygdala, that there's actually different impacts on that. And when we also have trauma, what happens is our frontal cortex and our limbic system are disconnected. And what does that mean? Our brain is not regulating emotions and we suppress it. Our brainstem is like fire, there's no safety. Our limbic system is, I don't know how to connect. We might have impact on our connection and belonging. And our reasoning brain, which really helps us think, but I honestly think sometimes we reason our way out of our thinking, which means our reasoning brain tries to act like we are good and shuts everything down. And then we end up firing off our limbic system later because it's not regulating well. And there's many different neurotransmitters that do impact us. There's 8 main neurotransmitters that are really impactful. But what happens is that we can shut down our brain. And so then we end up storing all of these suppressed emotions and it goes deep down into our body and it impacts us. Think about it. If you have some type of memory come up, or maybe you run into somebody that you thought you dealt with and you're like, oh, I'm good with that. And all of a sudden you have a gut punch to your stomach. That is essentially cellular memory trauma or experience that happened that there's emotions to that haven't been released from your body. And therefore, all of a sudden it comes up. That's a reaction or response. And it's not just the gut, it's the gut, heart, and our mind are all connected with when it comes to trauma. Or sometimes I've had different people, even clients, for example, have different pain when they say something in their arms or their legs or their stomach or their gut or their throat. And what that is that event or whatever that happened, either A is linked to change to the emotions to the event. It's also impacting not just the belief system, but it's also impacting the memory. And so imagine that for years, we talk about historical trauma such as when we have Holocaust survivors, when we have people that were part of racial slavery, when we have people part of wars, but we don't talk about that actually that impact on those people when they don't actually deal with it can impact generations. That stress, that anxiety, the feelings actually, because you have a mom and a dad who have a baby that impacts that baby, whether we know it or not, and mom and dad didn't know that. And so that can happen over generations. And I'm really excited because the new research coming out is going to show just that. It's going to show just that we have emotions and we have different responses that can impact our body and how we respond to it. And if not addressed, it can impact our generations. And that can be in our emotions. And so you always hear, and when we talk about brain development with family, oh, they're just like me. They're just acting just like grandma. Well, how did that happen? It's not necessarily, there's something about that. There's something about the events or even the belief systems that were impacted because there's traumatic events. And that actually goes back to a lot of cognitive behavioral therapists, which I think is amazing, like Dr. Aaron Beck. And even a lot of them were thinking about like how we think. But what happens is we didn't realize that emotions can attach to, but we can release emotions. And that is the powerful part about it, is that there's ways now to release trauma, that we don't have to continue in that. And so sometimes it can take time because there's traumas that happen in one event or ongoing trauma over periods of time. But what's fascinating is that as we address it and as there's a way to connect the brain, because when we're developing, a lot of times kids are responding to trauma. There's responses to trauma when we're younger or events that we don't know how to have the language for. And that's precisely how trauma does impact our brain. That's another example, is that when trauma happens, we don't have the language. A lot of times it happens to kids when they're younger. And so all these big emotions are there and we're not quite sure how to identify that. And so imagine kids having these big emotions and it stunts our emotional development at that time, or even our physiological. And later we may have the words, but we don't have it then. Or maybe later an event happens and boom, oh, that I remember when I was 3, this happened. Or, oh, I didn't know how to say this feeling. And so that's exactly what happens. And when we have ongoing trauma, it can impact behavior, our belief system of who we are. It can also impact our academics. So a lot of times you have families or children who are impacted. So brain development, it can impact earlier. It can impact our academics or even how we view ourselves. The good news is that the brain is malleable. It's more malleable than we think. Dr. Carolyn Leaf always says that there's ways to shift our thinking. Neuroscience shows that. New neurons happen every day. We can have neuroplasticity where neurons can shift, but the big important thing is that, yes, we can shift it, but when emotions are still attached to it, that has to leave. And that I've learned a lot from Craig Miller, who talks a lot about the brain and really just the emotions that can be impacting us from older events, even all the way back to childhood. Now, when we have events, sometimes we don't realize the impact on us or our relationships till way later in our life. And that is part of the journey. And sometimes the brain is protecting us because it's something so heartbreaking or so hard to realize the violation that we shut that part down. And so that subconscious happens. But a lot of times people don't want to go there. But in my viewpoint, it actually inhibits us later. It inhibits parts of emotional maturity and even parts of our identity that get impacted by trauma and the brain development. The good news is, as we found with stroke patients, there's been studies even with children with trauma, that we can shift, release the emotions, and also shift in our thinking and have what's called post-traumatic growth. Now, for me personally, post-traumatic growth can happen. I think that sometimes we think that it's further than it is, but then all of a sudden the event comes back. People are like, well, I'm done with that. But no, you're done for that moment. That's what you could handle. And then there's some deeper digging. Because with trauma, think about the brain, it looks like a lot of a tree. There's a lot of different roots, and the brain is able to be very flexible. The brain does shift, but it's important to really look into what's going on with brain development. And so trauma at any stage of our lives can impact us, whether earlier or later. But a lot of times when we have childhood trauma, that can impact people early on, teenage years, at early adulthood, and it continues to grow because nothing's been dealt with. And then you have other events that can impact people where, say, they had childhood trauma, they were doing well, didn't realize there was more stuff, had another traumatic event, boom. Then all of a sudden there's subconscious stuff's coming up because they're going in a deeper healing. Sometimes people have it, but they're taught to avoid it. So they just kind of live life without ever dealing with it. So it's been really interesting looking at brain science and science studies and even more brain research, which is showing that yes, that trauma does impact our brain. It does impact our body. It impacts our health. It impacts everything about us, including our thinking. And the good news is that we can shift and trauma can heal in the brain. And sometimes it's scary because we don't know where to go and we don't know how to get there. And that's why you have counselors, you have people that are helping even in coaching fields, you have people that are helping in education. There's different ways that there could be trauma informed. Again, if it's specific therapies, then you go to a counselor, LBC, and it's important to do that. It's important to really uncover what is going on and how to move forward. And so brain trauma and its impact on the brain is huge. Trauma does impact all of us as human beings have had some form of trauma, whether it's been, and we call it little t, but small traumas to big traumas. And every human being has a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. Fight being that we want to fight, like we're like, oh, I got to protect myself. Flight is, oh, I'm scared, I want to protect myself by running away. Freeze is we freeze, it's like our body can't move. And then fawning is where we just please people, whatever they do, just so that we don't have to rock anything, or we're scared that somebody's going to say something or do something opposite, and that might be scary for us. And so there's 4 different types of responses, but that happens all the time. And then imagine that people who've gone through quite a bit of traumas or different complex traumas, that they're operating not just in that, but also thinking, oh my goodness, I'm responding, and their responses are even heightened. So anytime something happens when it's a trigger, and we all have some different triggers that might upset us, and anytime we have a trigger, it's a heightened emotion based on something that hasn't yet healed in us, or something that has been painful, and it still matters. It matters, every single thing, but we have a high injustice or anger because that hasn't been dealt with. We're still holding on because there's not release of those emotions and the terror or the fear or the fright that happened from it. And so sometimes our body can shut down. It's called hypoarousal, where we shut down our emotions. We're depressed, or like we're really tired, and we just shut it down. And the opposite of that is when we are hyper aroused, which is like high anxiety, anger, very hot anger, because like that's just where our brain is. It goes from, so we either go high up or low, and there's a window of tolerance. But what that basically is, our mind, our peace. And so a lot of times if you have trauma, your window is really short, but as you heal, that window grows, and you're not impacted to the degree you had been before. Now, I want to say that everybody's on a different place. Some people at the beginning of their journey, the quarter of their journey, the middle, in the specific event that happened, and it matters, and you're taking your time or whatever needs to happen for that process. And sometimes it is a shorter process, but there are layers at times, especially when it comes to complex trauma and other different traumas. So be kind to yourself, but also know that there is help out there, and you can actually be impacted by shifting in your brain with trauma and healing. And so a lot of times people are afraid of the healing process because it means like you're going down deeper into like the deepest heartache and stress that happened. And so as we're looking at this, that's a lot of the trauma in the brain, and it can impact our thinking, our organization, our planning, initiation, and it impacts us because think about it, the brain gets impacted over generations, and that any impact of the brain means that there may be different thinking patterns that happen as a result of the traumas. And so that's a very interesting point, which I'll talk about at some point as I continue in my research, and I'll be able to share more as I research a lot of these things and confirm it with many different people that will be looking at this, because I am going to continue to do that. And we'll be seeing and finding that, yes, when we don't silo this stuff, that across, especially biology matters. Because when you look at the brain in a neurobiological aspect, you're not just looking at neuroscience, you're looking at biology. And there's differences for when you look at men, they start to really mature and have emotional maturity, and also different parts of their brain, especially executive functioning in their 30s, 35, but also into the 40s if there's trauma, compared to science that shows from neuroscience to biology to neurobiology that women in their brain, they develop by their late 20s. But if you've had trauma, it'll go into your 30s. And so that's important. That means that we have differences in the male and female brain. And so when that develops is very different, but it doesn't mean that and so we can understand that there's different things that happen. And we actually can look at that across fields and bring it together and say, what is this all telling us about executive functioning, about brain development, about the brain, and how we think as men, as women, and how we can communicate as families, and how we can work with our children. And so these are very important points we want to look at, because you want to look across the different areas of the brain. And so I want to see if any of you are watching, and I think I see Elizabeth. Hi there, Liz. But if you have any questions about trauma in the brain, because there's so much, but I'm really touching on some points of the brain. And so, it's such a passion, because the brain is such a fascinating organ and part of our lives, but it really does impact us, because how we think, a lot of times we're really so hard on ourselves, but as we get older, we're like, oh wow, what was I thinking when I was younger? But a lot of times it was just that our brain was still developing. And if we've had trauma, it also impacts our brain as well, because we're currently dealing with the after effects, or even how we felt during that, or we might have froze during that, so our emotions are in that state yet. And so certainly there's a lot of good things coming when we bring the different research together to look at our brain, and knowing that we can shift, we can actually have strategies, we can use things to help us release our emotions, we can actually shift our thinking, and then there's new neurons, and we can do that day by day. Just even with a new habit, we can change the way we think, and it does take time, and there's different processes depending on each person. But that's the exciting part about this that I love, is that trauma doesn't have to be forever. There is a process. And as we're living and we're working with different people in different situations, there are different things we're going to process. So I'm glad that you're all here. If you have questions, you can definitely put it into the chat. I would love to answer any questions you have, certainly. And if you're watching this later and you have a question, please put it down. Again, I'm going to be having some new guests next week. I'm really excited. I may or may not have the first guest next week, because I actually am starting to interview a lot of the different guests, and I start next week. So just be on the lookout. I may be doing one more part of the trauma in the brain, and specific to some of your questions, or specific area of the brain that can be impacted but yet healed. And again, talk about that. So certainly you can put some of your ideas or your questions down in the chat and I'll answer it. But we will be starting to have new guests, really excited, from different backgrounds, and really excited to have that for y'all. So I hope you have a great night. Take care. And Traumaplicity Talk Show with Dr. Amanda Helman, that's me, happens every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on my page. I will be moving it to the YouTube page and podcast as we're moving and shifting, and it'll be on traumas. It'll continue to be on traumas and on my page, as well as on Apple and different podcasts. So I'm really excited about it, and I appreciate all of you for watching and continuing to support me. Have a great night. See you next week. Bye.